The morning sun cast long shadows across the small coffee shop near Fort Braxton as Sergeant Mike Rodriguez pushed through the glass door, the familiar chime announcing his arrival. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans mixed with the sweet scent of pastries filled the air, creating the perfect atmosphere for his daily ritual before heading to the base. Mike had been coming to Rosie's Corner Cafe for 3 years now, ever since he'd been stationed at the nearby military installation, and the routine had become as essential to him as his morning workout. Behind the counter, Sarah wiped down the espresso machine with practiced efficiency. She was a woman in her late 40s with shoulder-length brown hair that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Her movements were precise and deliberate, the kind that spoke of years of discipline and attention to detail. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans and a navy blue sweater, but something in her posture suggested a background that extended far beyond the confines of this small-town coffee shop. Mike approached the counter with his usual swagger, the confidence that came with 3 stripes on his sleeve and 8 years of military service under his belt. He wasn't a bad soldier by any means, but he carried himself with the kind of pride that sometimes bordered on arrogance, especially when he was around civilians who he assumed knew nothing about military life. His uniform was crisp and pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing spoke of someone who took his rank seriously. "Good morning," Sarah said with a warm smile as she looked up from her cleaning. "What can I get you today?" Mike glanced at the menu board above her head, though he already knew what he wanted. He'd been ordering the same thing for months, a large black coffee with an extra shot of espresso. But something about this woman's demeanor caught his attention. There was a quality to her presence that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Large black coffee, extra shot," he said, then added with a grin, "and make it strong. Us military folks need our caffeine to keep the world safe, you know." Sarah nodded and turned to the coffee machine, her movements efficient and purposeful. "Military, huh? What branch?" "Army," Mike replied, straightening slightly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, stationed at Braxton. Been serving my country for 8 years now." There was pride in his voice, the kind that came from genuine dedication to service, even if it was sometimes mixed with a tendency to show off. As Sarah prepared his coffee, Mike found himself studying her more closely. Something about the way she carried herself reminded him of the officers he worked with on base. There was a certain bearing, a way of moving and speaking that seemed to transcend civilian life. But he quickly dismissed the thought. Plenty of people had that kind of presence without any military background. 8 years is impressive, Sarah said as she worked. "What's your specialty?" Mike appreciated the question. Most civilians didn't know enough about military structure to ask about specialties, and it gave him an opportunity to talk about his work. "Communications and intelligence. I handle a lot of the coordination between different units, make sure information flows where it needs to go. It's not the most glamorous job, but it's important work." Sarah turned back to him, holding his coffee cup. "Communications is crucial in any operation. The best plans fall apart without proper information flow." She said this with the kind of understanding that made Mike look at her more carefully. "You sound like you know something about military operations," he said, accepting the coffee and taking a sip. It was perfect, strong enough to wake the dead, but smooth enough to actually enjoy. Sarah shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I pick things up here and there. This town has a lot of military families. You hear stories." Mike nodded, satisfied with the explanation. He'd encountered plenty of military spouses and family members who picked up knowledge through osmosis over the years. "Well, you make a hell of a cup of coffee. Better than anything we get on base, that's for sure." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I take pride in my work." Something in the way she said those words struck Mike as significant, though he couldn't say why. It wasn't just about coffee. There was a deeper meaning there, a sense of professionalism that went beyond customer service. Over the next few days, Mike found himself looking forward to his morning stops at Rosie's Corner Cafe more than usual. Sarah was always there, always pleasant and professional, and their conversations gradually became longer and more detailed. She asked intelligent questions about his work, understood military terminology in a way that impressed him, and seemed genuinely interested in his experiences as a sergeant. On Thursday morning, Mike decided to test her knowledge a little further. He'd been talking about some of the challenges his unit was facing with new communication protocols, and Sarah had offered insights that were surprisingly sophisticated. "You know," Mike said, leaning against the counter, "for someone who just picks things up from military families, you sure understand a lot about operational structure." Sarah paused in her coffee preparation, and for just a moment, Mike caught something in her expression, a flicker of something that might have been amusement or perhaps caution. But it passed so quickly, he wondered if he'd imagined it. "Like I said, you hear things," she replied smoothly. "Plus, I've always been interested in how organizations work, how information flows through complex systems. It's fascinating stuff." He'd never thought of his work in quite those terms, but she was right. The military was essentially a massive organization with incredibly complex information systems, and understanding how all the pieces fit together was crucial to making everything work effectively. "Exactly," he said, warming to the topic. "Most people don't realize how complicated it really is. They think it's all just taking orders and following procedures. But there's so much more to it. Strategy, logistics, personnel management, technology integration. It's like running a corporation, except the stakes are life and death." Sarah handed him his coffee, and their fingers brushed briefly as he took the cup. Her hands were soft but strong, with calluses in places that suggested she was no stranger to physical work or equipment handling. "What's the most challenging part of your job?" she asked, and Mike could hear genuine curiosity in her voice. Mike considered the question seriously. It was rare that anyone asked him about the actual challenges he faced rather than just thanking him for his service or asking about combat experiences he'd never had. "Honestly, it's the balance between following protocol and adapting to changing situations. You have to respect the chain of command and follow established procedures, but you also have to be ready to think on your feet when things don't go according to plan. And as a sergeant, you're right in the middle of it all. You're responsible for implementing the decisions that come from above, while also being responsive to the needs and capabilities of the people below you. That's a lot of responsibility for someone at your level." The comment stung a little, though Mike couldn't say exactly why. "My level" made it sound like being a sergeant was somehow insignificant, which bothered him more than it probably should have. He'd worked hard for his rank, and while he knew he wasn't at the top of the military hierarchy, he'd earned his position through dedication and competence. "Well," he said, a slight edge creeping into his voice, "Sergeant isn't exactly entry level. I've got real authority and real responsibilities. I'm not just some grunt following orders. I make important decisions every day." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Mike thought he detected another one of those fleeting moments where something passed across her face. "Of course," she said. "I didn't mean to minimize your position. Every rank serves an important function." Mike felt a little foolish for getting defensive, but something about her tone had rubbed him the wrong way. Every rank serves an important function. It sounded like the kind of thing a commanding officer might say to boost morale among the lower enlisted ranks. But Sarah was just a coffee shop worker, wasn't she? The next morning, Friday, Mike arrived at the cafe to find Sarah engaged in conversation with another customer, an older man in civilian clothes who nonetheless carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. Mike couldn't hear their conversation clearly, but he caught fragments of what sounded like a discussion about logistics and resource allocation. The older man was deferential in a way that seemed strange for a casual conversation, and when Sarah spoke, her voice carried a tone of authority that Mike had never heard her use before. When the older man left, Mike approached the counter with his curiosity piqued. "Friend of yours?" he asked, nodding toward the departing customer. "Just another regular," Sarah said, but there was something in her manner that suggested there was more to it than that. Mike ordered his usual coffee and found himself studying Sarah more intently than ever. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the depth of her knowledge about military matters, it all seemed to point to something more than just casual exposure to military families. But what could it be? Maybe she was a veteran herself, though she seemed too young to be retired. Maybe she was married to someone high-ranking, though he'd never seen a wedding ring. "Sarah," he said as she prepared his coffee, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," she replied, not looking up from the espresso machine. "What did you do before you worked here?" For the first time since he'd been coming to the cafe, Sarah seemed genuinely caught off guard. She paused in her work, and when she looked up at him, there was a moment of calculation in her eyes, as if she was deciding how much to reveal. "I traveled a lot," she said finally. Worked in various places, different kinds of organizations. Nothing as exciting as military service. It was clearly a deflection, but Mike didn't feel like he had the right to push further. After all, she was just the person who made his coffee. If she wanted to be mysterious about her background, that was her business. But as he left the cafe that morning, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Sarah than met the eye. The way she carried herself, her knowledge of military procedures, her ability to ask exactly the right questions, it all suggested a background that she wasn't sharing. And for some reason, that bothered him more than it probably should have. Over the weekend, Mike found himself thinking about his conversations with Sarah more than was probably normal for casual interactions with a coffee shop employee. There was something about her that intrigued him, and not just because she was attractive and intelligent. There was a mystery there, a sense that she was playing a role rather than simply being herself. When Monday morning came, Mike approached Rosie's Corner Cafe with a sense of anticipation that surprised him. He was looking forward to seeing Sarah again, to continuing their conversations, and maybe to solving the puzzle of who she really was. He had no idea that he was about to stumble into a situation that would challenge everything he thought he knew about rank, respect, and his own place in the military hierarchy. As he pushed through the cafe door, the familiar chime announcing his arrival, Mike had no way of knowing that his casual morning routine was about to become something much more significant. The woman behind the counter, the one who had been listening to his stories about the challenges of being a sergeant, the one who had been asking such insightful questions about military operations, was about to reveal something that would change his entire perspective on authority, assumption, and respect. The morning sun continued to stream through the cafe windows, casting the same long shadows it had every day for the past week. But this Monday morning would be different from all the others, in ways that Mike couldn't possibly have imagined when he'd first walked into Rosie's Corner Cafe and met the mysterious woman who made the best coffee he'd ever tasted. Sarah looked up as he approached the counter, that same warm smile on her face, and Mike felt the familiar sense of anticipation that had become part of his morning routine. He had no idea that he was about to learn a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of authority that would stay with him for the rest of his military career. Monday morning brought with it a sense of familiarity as Mike Rodriguez entered Rosie's Corner Cafe, but there was also an undercurrent of something different in the air. Perhaps it was his growing curiosity about Sarah, or maybe it was the way their conversations had been evolving over the past week, becoming more substantive and engaging with each passing day. Whatever it was, Mike found himself approaching the counter with a heightened sense of anticipation. Sarah was already behind the counter, organizing supplies with the same methodical precision she brought to everything she did. When she looked up and saw him, her smile seemed warmer than usual, more genuine, as if she too had been looking forward to continuing their morning conversations. "Good morning, Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, and there was something in the way she pronounced his rank that made Mike pause. Most civilians either ignored military titles entirely or used them awkwardly, unsure of proper protocol. But Sarah's use of his rank felt natural, practiced, as if she was accustomed to military formality. "Morning, Sarah," Mike replied, settling into what had become their usual routine. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet," she said, beginning to prepare his coffee without being asked. "Spent some time reading, catching up on current events. How about you? Did you get any time to relax?" Mike appreciated that she asked. Most people assumed that military life was either constant action or complete downtime, not understanding the reality of routine duties, paperwork, and the constant state of readiness that defined military service even during peaceful periods. "Actually had some interesting developments at the base," he said, leaning against the counter. "We're implementing some new communication protocols that are supposed to improve information flow between different units. It's the kind of thing that sounds simple in theory but gets complicated when you try to put it into practice." Sarah paused in her coffee preparation, and Mike caught a flicker of what looked like professional interest cross her face. "What kind of complications?" The question was asked with the kind of specificity that suggested she understood the complexities involved in large-scale organizational changes. Most people would have asked something generic like, "What do you mean?" or simply nodded politely without really caring about the details. "Well," Mike said, settling into what he realized was becoming a pattern of explaining his work to someone who actually seemed to understand it. The new protocols are designed to reduce communication delays and eliminate redundant reporting structures. But when you're dealing with multiple units that have been operating under established procedures for years, change management becomes a real challenge. Sarah handed him his coffee and leaned against the counter, giving him her full attention in a way that made Mike feel like his work actually mattered to someone outside the military structure. "How are they handling the transition?" she asked. "Are they doing a gradual rollout or implementing everything at once?" Mike was impressed by the sophistication of the question. Change management and implementation strategies weren't topics that most civilians would think to ask about, and certainly not with the kind of specificity that suggested real understanding of organizational dynamics. "They're trying to do a phased implementation," he explained, "starting with smaller units and gradually expanding to larger formations. The idea is to work out the bugs on a smaller scale before rolling it out system-wide. But even with that approach, you run into resistance from people who are comfortable with the old way of doing things." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Change resistance is one of the biggest challenges in any large organization. People develop workflows and relationships that serve them well under the existing system, and they're naturally hesitant to give those up for something new, even if the new system is objectively better. Mike found himself staring at her with growing amazement. Not only did she understand the concepts he was talking about, but she was articulating insights about organizational behavior that he'd never heard expressed so clearly, even by some of the officers he worked with on a daily basis. "Exactly," he said. "And the challenge for someone at my level is that I'm responsible for implementing changes that come from above, but I also have to deal with the practical concerns of the people who actually have to use the new systems. It's like being caught in the middle of a tug-of-war sometimes." Sarah's expression grew more serious, and when she spoke there was a quality to her voice that Mike hadn't heard before, a tone of authority and experience that seemed to come from deep personal knowledge rather than theoretical understanding. "That's one of the most difficult positions in any hierarchy," she said. "Middle management, which is essentially what you're describing, requires a completely different skill set than either frontline execution or high-level strategic planning. You have to be able to translate vision into action while also advocating upward for the practical needs of your people." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. The way Sarah had just described his position was so accurate, so insightful that it went far beyond casual observation or second-hand knowledge. She was talking about middle management challenges with the kind of nuanced understanding that could only come from personal experience in leadership positions. "You sound like you've dealt with these kinds of situations before," he said carefully, watching her reaction. Sarah seemed to realize that she might have revealed more than she intended. For just a moment, Mike caught a look of calculation in her eyes, as if she was deciding how much more to share. "I've worked in organizations with complex hierarchies," she said after a pause. "You learn to recognize patterns." It was another deflection, but Mike was beginning to understand that Sarah's evasions were as revealing as anything she said directly. No one talked about organizational hierarchy and change management with that level of sophistication unless they'd been in positions where those concepts mattered on a daily basis. "What kind of organizations?" Mike pressed gently. Sarah turned back to the espresso machine, ostensibly to clean it, but Mike suspected she was buying time to formulate her response. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Government work mostly, different agencies, different roles. Nothing too exciting." Government work. That explained a lot. The understanding of hierarchies, the familiarity with military terminology, the insights into organizational behavior. Mike felt a sense of satisfaction at having solved at least part of the puzzle, though he sensed there was still much more to Sarah's background than she was revealing. "Federal or state level?" he asked. "Both, at different times," Sarah replied, and Mike noticed that she was being careful to keep her answers vague while still being responsive to his questions. Over the next several days, their conversations continued to deepen and become more substantial. Mike found himself sharing details about his work that he normally only discussed with other military personnel, and Sarah continued to offer insights that impressed him with their depth and accuracy. She asked questions about resource allocation, personnel management, and strategic planning that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how large organizations operated. But it was on Thursday morning that Mike made a comment that would fundamentally change the dynamic between them. He'd been discussing some frustrations he was having with what he perceived as unnecessarily complex approval processes for routine decisions, and Sarah had been listening with her usual attentive interest. "The thing is," Mike said, settling into what had become a comfortable pattern of venting about military bureaucracy, "some of these procedures seem designed by people who have never actually had to implement them in the real world. You get these directives that come down from on high, and you can tell they were written by someone sitting in an office somewhere who's never had to deal with the practical realities of making things work on the ground level." Sarah's expression grew more serious, and Mike noticed a subtle change in her posture, a straightening that suggested he might have touched on something that mattered to her personally. "That's an interesting perspective," she said carefully. "Do you think senior leadership is generally out of touch with operational realities?" Mike, warming to the topic and feeling confident in his opinions after days of having Sarah listen respectfully to his views, leaned forward and spoke with the conviction of someone who believed he was sharing insights with someone who would appreciate his military experience. "Look, I've got a lot of respect for the senior officers," he said. "They've earned their positions, and they have responsibilities I can't even imagine. But the higher up you go in any organization, the further you get from the day-to-day realities of actually getting things done. A colonel or a general might understand strategy and big-picture thinking, but when was the last time they had to deal with a broken communication system, or a supply shortage, or a personnel problem that needs to be solved right now, not after it goes through 3 levels of approval?" Sarah listened to this speech with an expression that Mike couldn't quite read. There was something in her eyes that might have been amusement, or perhaps something more complex, a mixture of reactions that suggested his words were hitting closer to home than he realized. "So you think rank and experience don't necessarily correlate with practical understanding?" she asked. Mike, emboldened by what he interpreted as intellectual engagement with his ideas, continued his analysis with growing confidence. "Don't get me wrong," he said. "Rank matters, and experience matters. But there's a difference between understanding how things are supposed to work and understanding how they actually work. A sergeant like me might not have the big picture that a general has, but I guarantee you I know more about the nuts and bolts of daily operations than someone who's been sitting behind a desk at the Pentagon for the last 5 years. As soon as the words left his mouth, Mike realized he might have gone too far. There was something in Sarah's expression that suggested he had just said something significant, though he couldn't tell whether it was positive or negative. "That's a bold statement," Sarah said quietly. "You're essentially arguing that practical experience at lower levels gives you insights that senior leadership might lack." Mike felt a moment of uncertainty. Had he come across as disrespectful to senior leadership? Was he criticizing people he should have been respecting? But Sarah's tone seemed genuinely interested rather than critical, so he decided to clarify his position. "I'm not saying senior officers don't know what they're doing," he said. "I'm just saying that every level of the hierarchy has different kinds of knowledge and different perspectives. A general understands things I don't understand, but I understand things that might not be visible from their level. The problem comes when people at any level assume they have all the answers." And Mike caught something in her expression that looked almost like approval, but there was also something else there, a quality of assessment, as if she was evaluating not just his words but his entire approach to thinking about authority and leadership. "What do you think is the most important quality in a senior leader?" she asked, and there was something in the way she asked the question that made Mike feel like his answer mattered more than usual. Mike considered the question seriously. It was the kind of query that could easily lead to a superficial response about courage or decisiveness, but Sarah's thoughtful attention throughout their conversations had taught him to think more deeply about these topics. "Humility," he said finally, "not in the sense of being weak or indecisive, but in the sense of recognizing what you don't know and being willing to listen to people who have different kinds of expertise. The best leaders I've worked with are the ones who understood that their rank gave them authority to make decisions, but it didn't give them a monopoly on good ideas or practical insights." Sarah's reaction to this answer was unlike anything Mike had seen from her before. For just a moment, her carefully maintained expression of polite interest slipped, and he caught a glimpse of something that looked like genuine respect, and perhaps even surprise. "That's a very mature perspective," she said. And there was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't just making polite conversation. Mike felt a flush of pride at her approval, but also a growing sense that there was much more to this conversation than he understood. Sarah's reactions, her questions, her insights, Everything about her suggested a depth of experience and knowledge that went far beyond what she had shared about her background. "Can I ask you something?" Mike said, leaning forward slightly. "Of course," Sarah replied, though Mike noticed she seemed to tense slightly, as if preparing for a question she might not want to answer. "What's your background? Really? Because the way you talk about leadership and organization and military operations, it's not the way someone talks about things they've just picked up from conversations with military families. You understand this stuff from the inside." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Mike could see her weighing her response carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured and thoughtful. "Let's just say I've had more experience with military culture than I initially let on," she said, "but I prefer to keep my work life and my personal life separate. This job allows me to be just Sarah, not defined by my professional background." It was the most direct acknowledgement she had given that there was indeed more to her story, but it also made clear that she wasn't ready to share the details. Mike respected that boundary, even as his curiosity continued to grow. As their conversation wound down and Mike prepared to leave for the base, he found himself looking forward to the next day's interaction with an intensity that surprised him. Sarah had become more than just the person who made his morning coffee. She had become someone whose opinions he valued, whose insights challenged him to think more deeply about his work and his role in the military hierarchy. But as he walked toward his car, Mike had no idea how dramatically his perception of Sarah and of his own place in the chain of command was about to change. The woman behind the counter, the one who had been listening to his theories about leadership and his critiques of senior military officials, was carrying a secret that would soon reshape everything he thought he knew about rank, authority, and respect. Friday morning arrived with an unusual energy that Mike Rodriguez couldn't quite identify as he made his way to Rosie's Corner Cafe. The past week of increasingly deep conversations with Sarah had become the highlight of his daily routine, and he found himself looking forward to their interactions with an enthusiasm that went far beyond his appreciation for good coffee. There was something intellectually stimulating about talking with someone who understood military concepts so intuitively. Someone who asked the right questions and offered insights that challenged his thinking. As he approached the cafe, Mike noticed there were more cars in the parking lot than usual for this time of morning. Through the windows, he could see several people in civilian clothes seated at tables, but something about their bearing suggested they weren't typical coffee shop customers. They sat with the kind of alertness and spatial awareness that Mike associated with military or law enforcement personnel, even when they were off duty and out of uniform. The chime sounded as he entered, and Mike immediately noticed that the atmosphere in the cafe felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that made him more alert than usual. Sarah was behind the counter as always, but she seemed more focused this morning, more intense, as if she was preparing for something important. "Good morning," she said as he approached, and Mike caught something in her tone that he hadn't heard before, a formality that felt almost official. "Morning," Mike replied, glancing around at the other customers. "Busy day?" "You could say that," Sarah said, beginning to prepare his coffee. "How are things at the base?" It was a routine question, one she'd asked many times before, but something in the way she asked it this morning made Mike pay closer attention to his answer. "Actually, pretty interesting," he said. "We're getting a visit from some senior leadership next week. Word is that some high-ranking officials are coming to evaluate our implementation of those new communication protocols I was telling you about." Sarah paused in her coffee preparation, and Mike noticed her hands still for just a moment before she continued working. "High-ranking how?" she asked, and there was a sharpness to the question that caught Mike's attention. "Not sure exactly," Mike replied. "The scuttlebutt is that it might be someone from the Pentagon, maybe even a general. You know how these things work. They want to see how their brilliant new systems are working in the real world." Mike intended this last comment as a continuation of their ongoing conversation about the disconnect between senior leadership and operational realities, but Sarah's reaction was not what he expected. Instead of the knowing smile or thoughtful nod he'd come to expect, she gave him a look that was difficult to interpret. "But, and you don't think they'll understand what they're seeing?" she asked. There was something in her tone that made Mike pause. It wasn't the casual interest she'd shown in their previous conversations about military bureaucracy. This felt more personal, more pointed. "Well," Mike said, settling into what had become a comfortable pattern of sharing his opinions with someone he trusted to understand them. It's like I was saying the other day. These senior officers, they understand strategy and big-picture stuff. But when was the last time any of them dealt with the day-to-day reality of making these systems work? It's about history. They'll come in, get a briefing from the colonel, see a nice, clean demonstration, and think everything is working perfectly. But they won't see the workarounds we've had to develop, or understand the real challenges we're dealing with. As Mike spoke, he noticed that the conversations at other tables had grown quieter, as if people were listening to what he was saying. Sarah's expression had become increasingly serious, and when she handed him his coffee, their eyes met in a way that felt significant. "So you think senior leadership is generally out of touch with operational realities?" Sarah asked, repeating almost word for word a question she had asked earlier in the week. Mike felt a moment of confusion. Why was she asking the same question again? But he was comfortable enough with their relationship to continue the conversation in the same vein as before. "Look," he said, leaning against the counter, "I respect the rank and the experience that got them there, but let's be honest. A general who's been sitting in Washington for the last 5 years doesn't know more about the nuts and bolts of communication systems than a sergeant who works with them every day. They might have the authority to make decisions, but that doesn't mean they understand the practical implications of those decisions." The words hung in the air, and Mike suddenly became aware that the cafe had grown very quiet. The conversations at other tables had stopped entirely, and he could feel multiple pairs of eyes focused on him. Sarah's expression had changed as well. The casual friendliness had been replaced by something more formal, more serious. "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said, and her voice carried a tone of authority that Mike had never heard from her before. "Tell me, Sergeant Rodriguez, what do you think qualifies someone to understand operational realities?" The way she said his rank made Mike's stomach clench with sudden uncertainty. There was something official about it. Something that suggested this was no longer a casual conversation between a soldier and a coffee shop employee. "I guess," Mike started, then stopped, suddenly unsure of himself. "I mean, direct experience with the systems and the people who use them. Understanding how things actually work, not just how they're supposed to work on paper." Sarah nodded slowly, and when she spoke, her voice had taken on a quality that Mike was beginning to recognize as distinctly military. "And you believe that practical experience at your level gives you insights that senior leadership lacks?" Mike felt a growing sense that he had walked into something he didn't understand. The formal tone, the pointed questions, the way the entire cafe had grown quiet. It all suggested that this conversation was more significant than he had realized. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," he said carefully. "I'm just saying that every level of the hierarchy has different kinds of knowledge. A sergeant sees things that a general might not see, and vice versa. And what kinds of things does a sergeant see that a general might miss?" Sarah asked. Mike was beginning to feel like he was being interrogated, but he'd gone too far to back down now. Besides, everything he was saying was something he genuinely believed, and he'd been comfortable sharing these opinions with Sarah for the past week. "Well, for example," he said, "a general might look at our communication protocols and see that they meet all the technical specifications. But a sergeant knows that the system crashes every Tuesday morning, that half the passwords don't work the way they're supposed to, and that we've had to develop informal workarounds just to get our jobs done. A general sees the theoretical framework, but a sergeant sees the actual implementation." Sarah listened to this explanation with an expression that Mike couldn't read, but he noticed that several of the other customers had turned in their chairs to face their conversation directly. The pretense that they were having private conversations at their own tables had been abandoned entirely. "So you think senior officers are generally unaware of these practical problems?" Sarah asked. "Not unaware," Mike said, feeling like he was trying to navigate a minefield, but maybe not as connected to them as they could be. "It's not their fault. It's just the nature of hierarchy. The higher up you go, the more you have to rely on reports and briefings instead of direct observation. And you believe that creates a disconnect between senior leadership and operational reality?" Mike was getting tired of the formal questioning tone, and his discomfort was beginning to turn into mild irritation. Why was Sarah pushing this so hard? They'd had this conversation before, and she'd seemed to understand and even agree with his perspective. "Look, Sarah," he said, "I don't know why you're making this so formal all of a sudden. We've talked about this stuff before. Yes, I think there can be a disconnect between senior leadership and day-to-day operations. That doesn't mean I don't respect the chain of command or that I think generals are incompetent. I'm just saying that rank doesn't automatically make someone an expert on every aspect of military operations. The silence that followed his words was complete and uncomfortable. Sarah stood perfectly still behind the counter, studying his face with an intensity that made Mike increasingly nervous. The other customers had given up any pretense of privacy and were openly watching the interaction unfold. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said finally, and her voice carried a tone of unmistakable authority. "What would you say if I told you that your assumptions about senior leadership might be based on incomplete information? But I can only speak from my own experience and observations. And what if your experience and observations were about to be significantly expanded?" Mike felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Sarah's tone and manner that suggested this conversation was about to take a turn he wasn't prepared for. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," he said. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Mike's blood run cold. It was a military identification card, but not like any he'd seen before. The format was familiar, but the information on it made his world tilt sideways. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority, "and my rank is General United States Army, 4 stars. Mike felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. 4 stars. 4 stars meant she was one of the most senior officers in the entire United States military. 4 stars meant she had authority over hundreds of thousands of soldiers. 4 stars meant she was exactly the kind of senior leadership he had been casually criticizing for the past week. Mike started, then stopped, unable to form a complete sentence. His mouth had gone completely dry, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "For the past week," General Mitchell continued, "I've been listening to your opinions about senior military leadership, about the disconnect between rank and practical understanding, about how generals don't really know what's happening at the operational level." Mike wanted to disappear. He wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. Every casual comment he'd made, every criticism of senior leadership, every assumption about rank and competence, all of it had been said to someone who embodied everything he'd been talking about. "Ma'am, He tried again, but General Mitchell held up a hand to stop him. "I'm here," she said, "because next week's visit isn't just an evaluation of communication protocols. It's an assessment of leadership development and the flow of information through the chain of command. I wanted to understand how mid-level NCOs like yourself perceive senior leadership, what kinds of assumptions are being made, and whether there really is the kind of disconnect you've been describing." Mike felt like he might be sick. Everything he'd said, every opinion he'd expressed, every criticism he'd made, it had all been heard by someone with the authority to end his career with a single phone call. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I apologize. I had no idea." But General Mitchell wasn't finished. And what she was about to say would challenge everything Mike thought he knew about authority, respect, and the true nature of military leadership. The silence in Rosie's Corner Cafe stretched like a taut wire as Mike Rodriguez stood frozen, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hands. General Sarah Mitchell, 4 stars, United States Army, studied him with an expression that was impossible to read. The revelation of her true identity had hit Mike like a physical blow, and he could feel the weight of every casual comment he'd made about senior leadership pressing down on him like a mountain. "Ma'am," Mike managed to say again, his voice cracking slightly, "I sincerely apologize for any disrespect. I had no idea who you were, but that's no excuse for—" General Mitchell raised her hand again, and Mike immediately fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of calm authority that made it clear she was accustomed to being listened to without interruption. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, "before you continue apologizing, I want you to understand something. I didn't reveal my identity to make you uncomfortable, or to put you in an impossible position. I revealed it because our conversations this week have been among the most valuable intelligence gathering I've done in years." Mike blinked, confusion replacing some of his terror. "Intelligence gathering?" What could a four-star general possibly learn from his casual complaints about military bureaucracy? I don't understand, ma'am, he said. General Mitchell came around from behind the counter, and Mike noticed that the other customers, who he now realized were almost certainly military personnel in civilian clothes, had arranged themselves to provide privacy for their conversation while maintaining security awareness of the broader environment. "Sit down, Sergeant," she said, gesturing to a table near the window. It wasn't really a request. Mike sat, his movements stiff and uncertain. General Mitchell took the seat across from him, and up close, he could see details that should have given away her true identity: the confidence in her posture, the way her eyes constantly assessed her surroundings, the subtle calluses on her hands that spoke of years handling military equipment. How had he missed all the signs? "For the past 15 years, General Mitchell began, I've been in positions where people tell me what they think I want to hear. Subordinates filter information to avoid problems, peers compete rather than collaborate, and civilians treat me like a symbol rather than a person. Do you know how rare it is for someone to give me their honest, unfiltered opinion about military leadership?" Mike stared at her, beginning to understand that this conversation was heading in a direction he hadn't expected. "When I took this assignment," she continued, "working undercover in a civilian capacity to assess the real attitudes and perceptions at the operational level, I knew I might hear criticism. What I didn't expect was to find someone who could articulate the challenges of middle management in the military with such clarity and insight." "Ma'am, I was just complaining," Mike said, still struggling to process what was happening. "No, Sergeant, you weren't just complaining. You were identifying real structural problems in how information flows through our organization. You were describing the practical realities that don't make it into official reports. And most importantly, you were doing it from a position of genuine care about making the system work better, not from a place of disrespect or insubordination." Mike felt a flicker of hope that maybe he wasn't about to be court-martialed, but he was still deeply confused about what General Mitchell wanted from him. "I want to share something with you," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You talked about how senior officers lose touch with operational realities. You said we sit in offices and make decisions without understanding how they affect the people who have to implement them. You suggested that rank doesn't automatically confer understanding of practical challenges." Mike winced as she repeated his words back to him, but her tone remained neutral and professional. "You were right," she said simply. Mike's mouth fell open. "Ma'am, you were right about almost everything you said. The disconnect you described is real. Senior leadership does often lose touch with day-to-day operational realities. Rank doesn't automatically make someone an expert on every aspect of military operations. And the perspectives of NCOs like yourself are often undervalued in the decision-making process." Mike felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. This was not how he had imagined this conversation going when General Mitchell first revealed her identity. "But ma'am," he said, "that doesn't change the fact that I was disrespectful. I made assumptions about senior leadership without having the full picture." "Yes, you did make assumptions," General Mitchell agreed. "But they were reasonable assumptions based on your experience. And, more importantly, you were willing to articulate them clearly and thoughtfully. That's exactly the kind of feedback that senior leadership needs to hear, even if it's uncomfortable." She paused, and Mike could see her weighing her next words carefully. "Let me tell you something about my background. Sergeant Rodriguez. I started as a second lieutenant in military intelligence 25 years ago. I've served in combat zones, commanded units at every level from company to corps, and spent time in the Pentagon working on strategic planning. I've been promoted through the ranks because I've demonstrated competence at each level, but also because I've tried never to forget what it was like to be responsible for the practical implementation of other people's decisions." Mike listened, fascinated despite his nervousness. He'd never heard a senior officer talk about their career progression in such personal terms. "But the higher I've risen in rank," General Mitchell continued, "the harder it's become to get honest feedback about how my decisions affect the people who have to live with them. Everyone wants to tell the general that her plans are brilliant and her leadership is inspiring. What they don't want to tell me is that the new communication protocol crashes every Tuesday morning, or that the approval process I implemented to improve accountability is actually preventing people from doing their jobs effectively."
"You knew about the Tuesday crashes?"
Mike asked, surprised. I do now, General Mitchell said with a slight smile, because you told me, and that's exactly the kind of information I need to make better decisions. Mike was beginning to understand that this conversation was more than just a revelation about mistaken identity. General Mitchell was talking about fundamental questions of leadership and organizational effectiveness. Here's what I learned from our conversations this week, she said. You understand the challenges of middle management in the military better than most officers I've worked with. You can see problems from multiple perspectives: the strategic concerns of senior leadership, the practical needs of junior personnel, and the operational realities of day-to-day implementation. And most importantly, you care enough about making the system work to think critically about how it could be improved. Ma'am, I appreciate you saying that, but I'm just a sergeant. I don't have the big picture that you have. That's exactly my point, Sergeant Rodriguez. You don't have my big picture, but you have a different picture that's just as important. You see things I can't see from my position. You understand challenges that don't make it into my briefings. The question isn't whether your perspective is better or worse than mine. The question is how we can combine different perspectives to make better decisions. General Mitchell reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, which she opened to a page covered with handwritten notes. Over the past week, you've identified specific problems with our new communication protocols. Describe practical workarounds that your unit has developed. Explain the real challenges of implementing policy changes in operational environments, and articulated insights about leadership that I haven't heard from officers with 20 years of experience. All of that information is valuable, and most of it would never have reached me through normal channels. Mike looked at the notebook, realizing that General Mitchell had been taking detailed notes on their conversations. Every casual comment he'd made, every criticism he'd offered, every insight he'd shared, she'd been recording it all as valuable intelligence about how the military actually functioned at the operational level. What happens now, ma'am? Mike asked. Now, General Mitchell said, closing the notebook. I want to offer you an opportunity. The assessment I'm conducting here is part of a larger initiative to improve information flow and decision-making in the Army. We're looking for NCOs who can serve as liaisons between operational units and senior leadership, people who can translate between the strategic perspective and the practical reality. Mike felt his heartbeat quicken. What kind of opportunity? I want you to consider a temporary assignment to my staff. 6 months, working directly with senior leadership on implementation assessment and feedback systems. You'd be responsible for identifying the kinds of problems you've been describing, developing solutions that work at the practical level, and helping senior officers understand the real impact of their decisions. Mike stared at her, unable to process what he was hearing. An hour ago, he'd been a sergeant who made casual complaints about military bureaucracy to his favorite coffee shop employee. Now he was being offered a position working directly with a 4-star general on high-level organizational issues. Ma'am, I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that, he said. Sergeant Rodriguez, General Mitchell said, and her voice carried the kind of certainty that came from years of making important decisions. You've just spent a week demonstrating exactly the qualifications I'm looking for. You understand operational realities, you can think critically about organizational problems, you can articulate complex issues clearly, and you care about making the system work better for everyone involved. And she paused, and when she continued, there was something almost personal in her tone. But more than that, you had the courage to express honest opinions about senior leadership when you thought you were talking to a civilian. That kind of intellectual honesty is rare in any organization. And it's exactly what we need if we're going to solve the problems you've been describing. Mike felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what General Mitchell was offering, but also by a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, his casual complaints about military bureaucracy might actually lead to something meaningful. "Can I ask you something, ma'am?" he said. "Of course. When you were listening to me criticize senior leadership all week, what were you thinking?" General Mitchell was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, her voice carried a note of what might have been vulnerability. "I was thinking that you were describing problems I've been worried about for years, but hadn't been able to get honest feedback about. I was thinking that maybe there was hope for bridging the gap between strategic vision and operational reality. And I was thinking that the Army needs more people who care enough about excellence to risk being uncomfortable in service of making things better." Mike looked around the cafe, at the other personnel who had been quietly providing security for this conversation. at the woman who had been serving him coffee all week and had turned out to be one of the most senior officers in the United States military. Everything about his world had changed in the space of an hour, and he was beginning to understand that the changes were just beginning. "What do you say, Sergeant Rodriguez?" General Mitchell asked. "Are you ready to help turn your criticisms into solutions?" 6 months later, Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez, he had been promoted during his temporary assignment, stood in a conference room at the Pentagon, looking out at a group of senior officers that included 2 lieutenant generals, 4 colonels, and General Sarah Mitchell herself. The mahogany table was covered with reports, charts, and data presentations that represented the culmination of the most intense and rewarding 6 months of his military career. The transformation in Mike's life since that Friday morning revelation at Rosie's Corner Cafe had been nothing short of extraordinary. What had started as a casual conversation about coffee had led to a complete reimagining of how he understood military service, leadership, and his own potential for contribution to the organization he'd served for 8 years. General Mitchell, dressed in her Army service uniform with 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders, looked across the table at Mike with an expression of professional satisfaction. The woman who had served him coffee while patiently listening to his complaints about military bureaucracy was now preparing to present the results of their collaborative effort to improve communication and decision-making throughout the Army. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Mitchell began, "6 months ago, Sergeant Rodriguez and I began an assessment of information flow and feedback systems in our operational units. What we discovered was both troubling and encouraging. Troubling because it confirms significant problems in how decisions are communicated and implemented throughout our organization, but encouraging because it also revealed that we have personnel at every level who are capable of identifying solutions if we're willing to listen to them." Mike felt a familiar flutter of nervousness as attention turned toward him, but it was different from the paralyzing terror he'd experienced when General Mitchell first revealed her identity. 6 months of working directly with senior leadership had taught him that rank, while important, didn't make people superhuman. The generals and colonels in this room were intelligent, dedicated professionals who faced the same kinds of organizational challenges as everyone else, just at a different scale and level of complexity. "Sergeant First Class Rodriguez," General Mitchell continued, "has spent the past 6 months embedded in various units throughout the Army, assessing the practical implementation of policies and procedures that originate at senior levels. His findings have been illuminating, and I believe they point towards systemic improvements that could significantly enhance our operational effectiveness." Mike stood and activated the presentation screen, displaying the first of several charts that represented hundreds of hours of research, interviews, and analysis. The work had been challenging in ways he'd never expected, not just intellectually, but emotionally, as he'd learned to see the military from perspectives he'd never considered before. "Thank you, General Mitchell," Mike said, his voice steady and confident in a way that would have amazed the man who'd been casually complaining about senior leadership 6 months earlier. "What we found was that the communication challenges I originally described in our informal discussions were more widespread and systematic than any of us initially realized." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a flowchart of how information moved through military hierarchies. "The problem isn't that senior leadership doesn't care about operational realities, or that mid-level personnel don't understand strategic objectives. The problem is that we have structural barriers that prevent different levels of the organization from sharing information effectively in both directions." Lieutenant General Harrison, a tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes, leaned forward in his chair. "Can you give us some specific examples, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez?" Mike had learned during his 6 months of working with senior officers that they appreciated directness and specificity, not the kind of vague generalizations he might have offered in his previous role. "Yes, sir," he said. "For instance, the communication protocol implementation I mentioned to General Mitchell during our initial conversations. The Tuesday morning system crashes weren't a technical problem. They were happening because the automated backup systems were conflicting with manual procedures that units had developed to work around earlier technical problems. The technical teams knew about the manual workarounds, the operational units knew about the system crashes, but there was no mechanism for sharing that information in a way that allowed anyone to see the complete picture." Colonel Martinez, a woman with an extensive background in logistics, nodded thoughtfully. So the problem wasn't the policy itself, but the fact that we were implementing new systems on top of informal adaptations that we didn't know existed. Exactly, ma'am, Mike replied, and this pattern repeated itself in multiple areas: supply chain management, personnel evaluations, training protocols, equipment maintenance. We kept finding situations where policies that looked good on paper were creating unintended consequences in practice, but there was no systematic way for that feedback to reach the people who could authorize changes. General Mitchell spoke up, adding context to Mike's findings. What Sergeant First Class Rodriguez discovered was that we have excellent bottom-up reporting for crisis situations and excellent top-down communication for major policy changes, but we lack effective systems for the kind of routine feedback that prevents small problems from becoming crises. Mike clicked to the next slide, which outlined the solutions they had developed during their 6 months of collaboration. This was the part of the presentation he was most proud of, because it represented not just criticism of existing systems, but practical recommendations for improvement. Based on our assessment, Mike continued, we're recommending a 3-part approach to improving information flow throughout the Army. First, we need to establish formal feedback mechanisms that allow operational units to report implementation challenges without those reports being interpreted as complaints or failures to follow orders. Second, we need to train middle management NCOs like myself and company-grade officers to serve as effective translators between strategic objectives and operational realities. And third, we need to create regular opportunities for senior leadership to observe operational implementation directly, without the filtering that normally occurs when generals visit units. Lieutenant General Harrison raised his hand slightly. That third point sounds like what you were doing when you worked undercover in the coffee shop, General Mitchell. Are you suggesting we need more of that kind of intelligence gathering? General Mitchell smiled, and Mike caught a glimpse of the woman who had served him coffee with such patience and insight. Not exactly undercover work, but yes, structured opportunities for senior leadership to interact with operational personnel in environments where honest feedback is encouraged rather than discouraged. The coffee shop conversations taught me things I couldn't learn from briefings or formal reports. But we shouldn't have to rely on chance encounters to get that kind of information. Mike advanced to the final slide, which showed projected improvements in operational efficiency based on pilot programs they had implemented in several units during the assessment period. We tested these approaches in 5 different units over the past 4 months, he said. The results exceeded our expectations. Implementation problems that previously took weeks or months to identify and resolve were being addressed in days. Personnel at all levels reported feeling more connected to the broader mission and more confident that their practical concerns were being heard and addressed. Colonel Davis, a logistics officer, looked up from the detailed report he'd been reviewing. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, these are impressive results, but I have to ask, how do we scale this kind of approach across the entire Army? The personal touch that made your assessment so effective seems difficult to replicate on a large scale. It was exactly the kind of question Mike had learned to expect from senior officers. They were always thinking about implementation at scale, about how to take successful small-scale initiatives and make them work across huge, complex organizations. Sir, that's the beauty of this approach, Mike replied. We're not trying to replicate the exact methods we used during the assessment. Instead, we're trying to replicate the principles: direct communication between levels, systematic feedback collection, and regular reality checking of policies against operational experience. The specific mechanisms can vary based on unit size, mission, and operational environment. General Mitchell stood up, signaling that the formal presentation was concluding. The recommendations in this report represent 6 months of the most thorough assessment of our internal communication systems that I've seen in my 25 years of service. But more than that, they represent a model for how we can leverage the insights and capabilities of personnel at every level to improve our overall effectiveness. She paused, looking around the room at the assembled officers. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez began this process by making informal observations about military bureaucracy during casual conversations. 6 months later, those observations have been transformed into systematic recommendations that could improve how our entire organization functions. That transformation happened because we were willing to take seriously the insights of someone whose perspective we hadn't been accessing through our normal channels. Lieutenant General Harrison closed his copy of the report and looked directly at Mike. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, this has been an impressive presentation, and these recommendations clearly have merit. But I'm curious about something. 6 months ago, you were a sergeant in a communications unit, expressing frustration about how the Army operates. Now you're briefing general officers on organizational improvement strategies. How has this experience changed your understanding of military service? Mike had been hoping someone would ask this question, because it gave him the opportunity to talk about the most important thing he'd learned during his time working with senior leadership. Sir, he said, the biggest thing I've learned is that everyone in the Army, from privates to generals, is trying to serve something bigger than themselves, and everyone is dealing with challenges that are more complex than they appear from the outside. When I was complaining about senior leadership 6 months ago, I was assuming that problems in the system meant that people were incompetent or didn't care. What I've learned is that most problems in complex organizations aren't caused by bad people making bad decisions. They're caused by good people working in systems that don't give them the information they need to make good decisions. He paused, thinking about how to express something that had become fundamental to his understanding of leadership. I've also learned that rank and authority create both opportunities and limitations. General Mitchell has the authority to implement changes that I could never authorize as a sergeant, but she also has responsibilities and constraints that I didn't understand from my previous position. The goal isn't to eliminate hierarchy or pretend that all perspectives are equally valid in all situations. The goal is to make sure that hierarchy serves its purpose of enabling good decisions rather than preventing them. General Mitchell nodded approvingly. Which brings us to the question of next steps. The assessment phase of this project is complete, but the implementation phase is just beginning. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, you've proven that you can identify problems and develop solutions, but are you ready to take on the challenge of helping implement these changes throughout the Army? Mike felt the same sense of possibility he'd experienced 6 months earlier when General Mitchell first offered him this opportunity, but now it was tempered with a realistic understanding of the complexities involved. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'd like to continue this work, but I also think it's important that it not depend on any one person. The whole point of what we've learned is that good ideas can come from anywhere in the organization, and that systems need to be designed to capture and implement those ideas regardless of who has them. Systems is smiled, spoken like someone who understands both the potential and the limitations of individual leadership. I think we found our next project director. As the meeting concluded and the senior officers began filing out of the conference room, General Mitchell approached Mike with an expression that combined professional satisfaction with something that might have been personal pride. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, she said, 6 months ago you complained that senior leadership was out of touch with operational realities. You were right, but you were also wrong. We weren't out of touch because we didn't care, or because rank had made us incompetent. We were out of touch because we didn't have effective systems for staying connected. You've helped us build those systems, and in the process, you've demonstrated something important about leadership. It's not about having all the answers. It's about creating conditions where good answers can emerge and be implemented. Mike thought back to that Friday morning in Rosie's Corner Cafe, when his biggest worry had been whether he'd been disrespectful to a coffee shop employee who turned out to be a 4-star general. The journey from that moment of terror to this moment of professional satisfaction had taught him more about military service, leadership, and his own potential than his previous 8 years of service combined. Thank you, ma'am, he said, for the opportunity, for the trust, and for teaching me that the best leaders are the ones who are willing to learn from anyone. General Mitchell extended her hand for a professional handshake, but her smile was warm with the memory of their conversations across a cafe counter. Thank you, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, for reminding me that the best ideas often come from unexpected places, and that true leadership means being willing to listen to them wherever they come from. As Mike left the Pentagon that afternoon, walking past the imposing monuments and formal ceremonies that represented the most visible aspects of military service, he reflected on how much his understanding of the Army had changed. The institution he served was still imperfect, still struggling with complex challenges, still working to balance competing demands and priorities, but it was also an organization filled with people who cared about excellence, who were willing to change when presented with better ways of doing things, and who understood that true strength came from the ability to learn and adapt. His phone buzzed with a text message from General Mitchell. "Coffee tomorrow morning. I know a place that makes excellent coffee and serves it with even better conversation." Mike smiled as he typed back his response. "Yes, ma'am. But this time, I'll try to remember who I'm talking to." Her reply came immediately. "Don't you dare!" The best conversations happen when people forget about rank and focus on ideas. As Mike walked toward the metro station, he realized that his journey from sergeant to organizational consultant was really just beginning. But he also understood that the most important lesson he'd learned, that good ideas and valuable insights can come from anywhere, and that the best leaders are the ones who create space for those insights to be heard and implemented, would guide him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The coffee shop conversations that had started as casual complaints about military bureaucracy had become the foundation for a career dedicated to making that bureaucracy work better for everyone it served. And perhaps most importantly, they had taught both a sergeant and a general that true leadership has nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with the courage to listen, learn, and grow.